So right, yes, you're all aware we're recording this session, and I'm hosting this today. My name is Juliana Rufus from the Dart Center, and this is the second of two webinars on reporting on climate change and the climate crisis. So last week we discussed how reporting on the climate crisis can affect the psychological well-being of journalists, and we had tips on how to deal with that. And in today's webinar, we're looking at news consumers and the impact that reporting on climate change and the climate crisis, we'll speak about language as well, can have on media consumers. And we're discussing and we will be asking what we can learn about this and how we may want to change our stories. And we have three amazing panelists who I will introduce you in a second. But the reason why this is so relevant is, of course, because we know from research that news consumers are always counting information and reporting on the climate change, the climate crisis, and environment amongst the top 5 topics that they want to hear more about. But the reality is that actually the news consumption gives us a different picture, and they don't necessarily follow that. And we're trying to understand why the engagement is not as high as we would like it to be. So yes, we're recording this session, and until about 20 minutes before the end, we will then switch to your questions and stop the recording. Very quickly about my own background. I'm originally a journalist and filmmaker. I've worked over 25 years as an investigative journalist and correspondent, was part of the team that launched Al Jazeera English for 16, stayed there for 16 years before joining the BBC as an executive producer. And then in August last year, I took on the running of Dart Center Europe. And a little bit quickly, a couple of very quick slides about the Dart Center. Daniel, if you could give us the next one. So the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma is a project of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism in New York. We have satellites in London, where I am, and in Melbourne. We're a resource center and global network of journalists, journalism educator, and health professionals, and we're all dedicated to improving media coverage on trauma, conflict, and tragedy. And we help journalists and media organizations to better deal with survivors of violence and trauma. And we're also working with journalists and media organizations to better understand how they may be affected by the coverage of difficult stories. And you see on the right-hand side of the screen, you see lots of resources on the website. And a very quick slide, and maybe one of my colleagues can post the link into the chat group. We have an annual fellowship, and applications for that are currently open. And before I introduce the panelists, I'm throwing to Paula, who will talk about Journalism Fund, our host today, who also have fellowships open for application at the moment.
Thank you, Juliana. Welcome everyone again to this session. We are very happy to co-organize this second webinar with the Dart Center. Thank you, Juliana, as well, for all the organization and for all the input. And we are happy to have our 3 speakers today. We will be also listening to their tips for journalists. And this webinar has been co-organized by the Dart Center and Journalism Fund, and specifically Journalism Fund has a program that is the Earth Investigations program that is supporting this webinar. And of course, we are open to organize similar events in the future. So if you have an organization that would like to organize these kind of webinars on other topics, but still related with environment, we are open to discuss any proposal. But we also would like to share more about our grants. And under the umbrella of the Earth Investigations Program, we have two specific grant programs. The first one is the Investigation Grants for Environmental Journalism, which is a grant that supports cross-border teams of professional journalists and or news outlets as well to conduct investigations into environmental affairs related to continental Europe. The next deadline, as you can see on the slide, is on the 27th of April. And if you manage to scan the first code QR, that is the QR code that is on the left, you can go straight to the link to book your pre-application session. So if you have questions or any remarks regarding the application, you can contact the project coordinator, you can book an hour to have this meeting. And of course, we would like to really help you to get a successful application. But then we also have another grant that is called Professional Development Grants for Environmental Journalism. This grant program is open for organizations with project proposals for collective development and support services to build the capacities of environmental investigative journalists. The next deadline for this grant program is on the 25th of May. And if you would like to schedule a meeting with the project coordinator, you can scan the QR code that is on the right. So please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any further questions regarding these grant programs. But of course, we also have other grant programs, and you can visit our website, Journalismfund.eu, if you would like to apply for the other grant programs that we have available for you. So with, well, having said this, I think we can move forward. Thank you, Juliana.
Okay, thanks, Paula, and we can come out of the presentation for a moment as I'm introducing our three panelists, and I'm really genuinely grateful that they've all given their time because they're all specialists and high-profile speakers on this subject, and I'm going backwards. So the first person that I would like to introduce is Professor Maren Urner. And Maren, if you want to give us a wave, thank you. So you're a neuroscientist by training, and I first met you at an investigative journalism conference where you gave a really fantastic talk about why our brains are so ill-equipped to think about the consequences of climate change. And we'll hear some of that later today. Today, you are a professor of media psychology at HMKW Hochschule for, so it's a German university equivalent of media communications and economy in Cologne. And you're also the author of two best-selling books in Germany that deal with the daily news overwhelm. So that's Maren. And then I'm going to the person is here in London, where I am, and that's Dr. Emma Lawrence. And you are the mental health lead for global innovation at Imperial College London, if you want to explain as well. Hi, Emma. You're a scientist with a bachelor in physics and chemistry. And then you went to Oxford, where you studied computational and clinical neuroscience. So you really, like Maren, you're coming at this with a scientific background. You are now a mental health innovations fellow at the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College. And that's where you're leading a really innovative program called Climate Cares. And we'll hear more from you about that later. And the thing that I'd like to add now is that your research has a really strong emphasis on how young people deal with climate change and the impact of climate change. And then last but not least, the person who will be our first speaker today is Rima Ashur, who is in Germany as part of a team of psychologists who have written a set of guidelines for journalists, media houses, and newsrooms with advice on how to cover the climate crisis, climate change. And again, I'll ask my colleagues to put a link of these guidelines for you in the chat. It's in German and in English. You can maybe put both links. You have a master's in psychology from the University of Vienna, and you have worked in research at various other universities. And then in 2019, you started your own training as a psychological psychotherapist. So finally, for the three presentations. So Remus is the first one. Thank you for agreeing to talk us through some of the difficulties that journalists have and newsrooms can have when covering climate change. So before you start, I just wanted to add that it's something that came up in the pre-discussion that Wolfgang Blau, whose name many of you may know, who was at Reuters Institute in Oxford, he's spoken about the fact that many journalists have a blind spot when it comes to understanding how much or how little news audiences know when factual terminology is covered. So, for example, the Paris Agreement or the 1.5-degree goal. So that's just something that I wanted to preload, that it's worth for anybody covering the climate crisis, checking how much the audience really know. But Rima, you have a presentation for us where you outline some of the other challenges, and we can go into the presentation for Rima, please.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Juliana, and for the invitation to speak here. I am volunteering for a group of psychologists in Germany that is called Psychologists for Future, and we are trying to contribute psychological knowledge and therapeutic knowledge and expertise to meet the challenges of the climate crisis. And within that group, I joined a subgroup that had a closer look at media coverage of the climate crisis. And we had a look what the issues are and how this affects the audience, and all of that obviously from a psychological perspective. And that's what I want to talk about today. Okay, I don't see the presentation now. It would be good if it started now. Ah, perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So what we had a look at is what's not working in climate reporting from a psychological perspective, and what can be done about it. Okay, we can continue to the next slide. And what I would like to talk about in the next few minutes is that there are a few phenomena which affect us psychologically. I will talk about fragmentation. I will explain it in more detail in just a minute. Then negative effects on well-being and agency, news avoidance, lack of trust, and disinformation. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So the first point is fragmentation. The climate crisis infiltrates every single area of our lives. It's not just about weather, politics, economy, or health. It's also about safety, well-being, agriculture, what we eat, how we move, do we get from one place to the other, how we travel, what kind of energy we use. There are so many different aspects which are affected by climate change and the climate crisis. It really goes literally in all areas of our lives. And the current reporting does not reflect that. We find that news reports about the climate crisis are often coming from the newsroom science, politics, or economics desk. That's also, Juliana, you just referred to Wolfgang Blau, one thing he wrote about. And the difficulty, the psychological difficulty with that, we see on the one hand, it's like it infiltrates all areas of life, but in the news reports, it's just about some of those things, is that the climate crisis in general is very hard to grasp on a biological level. Maren will speak a lot more about this later on, but just a quick overview in the beginning, we are just not evolutionary equipped to understand distance threats very well. There is something we call psychological distance. That's a concept which is about when we think that something is geographically far away or temporally far away. So we think it's like there will be a long time before it happens, or if it doesn't affect us, but just other people, or if there is some level of uncertainty about it. That creates psychological distance. And it means it's so much harder to grasp for us what's happening. And the conclusion is that to bring this nearer, to reduce this distance, we need to see information a lot more, and for a lot more in a lot more areas than we see it now. And what Wolfgang Blau says about this, and I really like how he put it there, that's why I'm just quoting it. Everyone should be a climate reporter. And if you're not a climate reporter right now, you will be. Okay, next slide, please. I brought two examples of what I mean by that. One example, the first one is from National Geographic, a piece about 25 breathtaking places and experiences for 2023. A beautiful piece with nice pictures, and you just get the feeling like, wow, it would be so great to go to all these places. And there is no mention of climate. There is no mention of what this means in terms of CO2 emissions. And that's the type of fragmentation I'm talking about. We all know that travel affects the climate, but we do as if there is just one aspect to it, which is it's beautiful to travel, we'll have a good time. And if you think about how we did that during the COVID pandemic, there was no piece about travel which did not mention that travel might have an effect on incidence rates. It was there everywhere. And the same is true for climate. It affects the climate, but we are not talking about it, or not enough. And that's the second example here, where especially this winter, I started to notice that it comes up a lot more, which is that tourism is affected, and especially skiing is affected by climate change. So in southern Germany and Austria, there are a lot of pieces about how climate change affects tourism industry. And I think this is one of the developments we are looking at, and which we think are important, that these things are connected. Okay, the second one is a piece from an Austrian magazine called Profil. And then we can continue to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, the second problem we are seeing are the negative effects on well-being and agency. Obviously, if you cover the climate crisis, it will have an effect on people's emotions, not because, or not mainly, or not only because of the way you write it, but the facts. The content, the fact that we have a climate crisis is emotionally arousing. And it can trigger feelings such as fear, worry, anger, shame, or grief, and a lot more. And that's not per se a problem. I will talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but the extent of it is quite alarming. What we see is that, for example, in Germany, 78% of people asked in a survey say they are concerned or very concerned about climate change. And also 78% expect severe damage for people in Germany, and 85% for future generations. And in another survey, where they ask young people in 10 countries worldwide, they found that 59% are very or extremely concerned about climate change. Over 50% experience sadness, fear, anger, powerlessness, helplessness, and guilt. And over 45% report negative effects on their daily life and level of functioning. And if we look at that, that is really a looming health and societal threat we are seeing here. Next slide. So I already said emotions are not bad per se. Actually, there is an advantage to our emotional reaction if we process them favorably, because they're an adequate reaction to an actual threat. So it's actually a good sign. The psychological distance has been reduced if people react emotionally to what's happening. And these emotions have important functions in our lives. They provide us with orientation, prioritization, motivation, impulses for decision-making, and the energy for action. We really need them. They are our natural or biological basis for agency. However, there is another side to it, and that's when unfavorable processing comes into play. And that's, we like to avoid pain. Pain in general and painful emotions are part of that. And if we do that, that leads, for example, to news avoidance, to denial, and to lack of agency, which really isn't helpful in the case of the climate crisis. And this becomes the dominant form of processing, especially when helplessness, powerlessness, or hopelessness as emotions come into play. So what can we do to promote favorable processing? And what is helping people in general is validating their emotions, telling them they're an adequate reaction to what's happening. And they are also widespread, so they are not alone with these emotions. And the other aspect is that to get out of the helplessness, it really helps if there are also solutions to read about, to learn about, and coping strategies. That is helpful. Okay, next slide. I have another example here from The Guardian, a piece I found just a few days ago, I think. And I noticed the headline and the picture, and that's why I'm showing you this, because I opened this and I saw doom loop, climate crisis and doom loop, and a picture of which looks really like a lot of pollution. And I noticed immediately that I have an emotional reaction to it. And it's not just a reaction of like grief that this is happening, but it was more like if we are doomed and we are even in a loop, that's really, really frustrating. And I felt helpless when I saw it. And so to give you an example, what I mean by this, how people can react, that's one where I notice it myself, and maybe you can see that too in that picture. Okay, the next slide. Yeah, I already talked a little bit about how news avoidance comes into play here. And I also would like to present a few numbers about news avoidance in Germany. So in general, when you ask Germans why they avoid news, many of them say because they have a negative impact on their mood. So that's the part of pain avoidance that we all want to do. And what we see is there is a significant climate fatigue in Germany. 45% occasionally avoid information or news about climate change, and 25% even do so very frequently. And around 30% are tired of hearing about climate change. And the problem about that is those people who are especially fatigued with regard to climate change and hearing about climate change, they tend to agree a lot more with statements of avoidance and delay of climate protection. So if you avoid the news, then you're more likely to agree with a statement that climate action is harmful, or that it's not possible, that it's not working, or it should be, or other people should do it first. So what we see is if people read more news and they are more informed, they tend to agree less with these statements, which obviously is helpful. What we found is also that strongly fear-inducing messages without the portrayal of applicable solutions are more likely to lead to such defensive reactions. And it appears to be most likely when fear and guilt is triggered in combination with feelings of helplessness. So we are back to helplessness that I already talked about before. And this helplessness leads to resignation. And I have another picture to show what I mean. Thank you. So this is also a beautiful presented piece about also very well researched and a lot of interesting facts in the piece. But it starts off with on the one hand, a very beautiful picture of a glacier. And on the other hand, this headline, "This glacier determines the future of mankind." And when I saw this headline, I felt really, really small. I can do whatever I like personally to avoid being harming to the climate, like what I eat or how I get from one place to the other. But it feels like it's not important. It's like I'm completely powerless because this is something on an entirely different level. So that's one thing I just wanted to show you with this example, and maybe you can feel a little bit of that too, what I experienced. Okay, the next slide, thank you. We have one or two more issues. One is the lack of trust. In Germany, we see a rather high level of trust in the media in general. So 50% answer in a survey that they generally trust in the media. In this survey, there was an international comparison. Finland ranked highest with 69%, the US lowest with 26%. But on the other hand, we see that when it comes to dealing with climate change, the picture is very different. 56% have little or no trust in the media in Germany when it comes to that. And in the run-up to this seminar, Juliana asked me, why is that? And actually, these surveys don't tell us anything about it. But I had a look what I could find about this, and there are a few theories about that. So one is that there is too much focus on problems rather than on solutions. And if it's about trust in can you deal well with climate change, obviously solutions are part of that. And the second is that there is too much focus on personal responsibility rather than on a systemic context. So it's a lot about what can individuals change, what do individuals have to do, and we often feel that's not helping enough. And then again, helplessness comes into play. Okay. The last point I would like to talk about is disinformation. Obviously, that's a very well-known topic. And from a psychological perspective, what we have to deal with is the so-called illusory truth effect. And this means that the perceived credibility of information increases with repetition, regardless of its accuracy. So if you read an information 10 times, it becomes more credible to you, no matter if it's actual factual information. And obviously there is a need to counter that. And we saw a lot of that during the pandemic. And the same would be helpful in the climate crisis. Expose misinformation, provide fact checks, and also frequently cover factual information, because the same is this truth effect also happens with, obviously not just with fake news, but also with factual information. If you present it more often, then people will trust it more. And I have another example about how to counter disinformation. From Süddeutsche Zeitung once more, there was a piece recently about the effects on the environment of speed limits on highways. And there was a lot of information in it, but I just would like to show you one of the pictures where they show the level of CO2 emission depending on the speed you're driving. And that's a kind of factual information. You can see how it affects the climate or the CO2 emissions. And the whole article was something like showing people, okay, if you do that, this will be reached. And I think that's a very helpful way to go about it. Yeah, we can skip that for now, because I will get back to that later, this slide. And because now Emma and Maren will talk a lot more about some of the things I just mentioned. They will give you more details about them. This group, Juliana mentioned that I'm working with, we published media recommendations, and I will get back to them after the presentations of Emma and Maren. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Rima. That was a really great way of starting us off. And of course, I've done some reading in preparation for this. Of course, I would and I should. And I did find the comparisons with the COVID crisis quite helpful, because there was a similar threshold in terms of the science that people need to understand, and that of course there was a sense of urgency that something needs to change, and somehow there were few barriers. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more later, about the way science was presented and how everybody became science literate, and there was a sense of urgency, and the question is, what can we learn from how the COVID crisis was, how the pandemic was reported on, how we are reporting on climate change. So the next person who will go into a little bit more detail, because Emma, you've done some really cutting edge and amazing research on the climate crisis, young people and mental health, and you're following on from from Rima now before we get to Maren, who will then talk us through some of the more practical steps of how we can actually change our reporting. Over to you and to your presentation.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks so much. If you can pull up the slides again. So that was a wonderful introduction, Rima. I think that there are very, very similar themes that all three of us are going to be sharing, but from different angles, and hopefully that reinforces the messages of this importance and the ubiquity of this also across different contexts. If you can please pull up the slides again. Great. So if we just go to the next one. So I'll just very briefly introduce myself. You've heard about me already, but just to say I grew up on Ghana country in the Adelaide Hills, had a very strong connection to nature. My house is surrounded by koalas, etc. But I'm already seeing the impact of the climate crisis on my home country very strongly, and this disconnection between what's happening and what's happening in politics. So I studied physics and chemistry. I also worked in climate activism on the ground in Australia as a young person, and then did science communication and traveled around Australia as part of a science circus and did some science journalism and education before moving to the UK 10 years ago to study neuroscience. And alongside my studies, I founded It Gets Brighter, a mental health charity for young people, sharing messages of hope and support. And so that sense for myself as a young person who'd experienced mental illness was this need for hope and this need for understanding of the possibility of a brighter future, and the sense that we could hold both the challenges and the struggle and the hope alongside, and that sense of not being alone. And I think a lot of those things are universal to what's also happening in the context of young people grappling with the climate crisis and all of us grappling with the climate crisis. So I brought these things together into my work in Imperial. So if we go to the next slide, I started at Imperial 4 years ago and was working with youth mental health charities and on research with such data sets. And really noticing that in the context of discussing all of the challenges to youth mental health around social media and education, stresses, bullying, all of these extremely relevant, what wasn't being discussed was the broader context that young people were growing up in and what it means to grapple with the changing world and the uncertainties that they were facing. And this is something that my work in neuroscience, I was studying how we make decisions with different levels of missing information, how that interacts with our predisposition to anxiety. And, you know, this is something that then translates very much into how we can process the uncertainties and sit in the uncertainties of the climate crisis. So Climate Cares is now our program in climate change and mental health. And we're a team of researchers, designers, policymakers, or policy experts, I should say, rather than makers, and educators trying to both understand and support mental health in the context of the climate crisis. And it's a partnership between the Institute of Global Health Innovation and the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. If we can go to the next slide, I just want to very quickly talk at a high level of how climate change is intimately connected with mental health and well-being. We've already heard around the need to vitally understand our psychological responses, the way we're emotionally and psychologically responding to climate change. But at an even higher level, and this goes to Rima's point of climate impacting every level of our society, the changes that are happening to our geophysical systems in changing temperatures, sea levels, and more frequent, acute and extreme weather and climate events, those are impacting every facet of our society, and the changes we need in response to this transformation impact every facet of our society. And we're actually destabilizing the conditions needed for good mental health and well-being with a changing climate. So if we can go to the next slide, we can see that through these changes to our climate and wider geophysical systems, we're seeing that people are being more and more exposed to loss and damage to homes and property. They're directly experiencing high temperatures. There's a loss of habitats, community breakdown, forced migration. And obviously these things are being covered in the media, but what's often not covered is that people side of what's happening to people's mental health and psychology, and the fact that what we need for good mental health and well-being are the living and working conditions, the access to clean air, clean water, these systems that are being challenged through the changing climate, and how that's kind of compounding risks on different communities. But also how witnessing these changes to your homeland, to your community, and learning about these effects also have an impact, which is what we're discussing today. So if you go to the next slide, this can result in a range of mental health and well-being effects. So we're seeing, for example, at higher temperatures, there's more cases of suicide and deaths by suicide, more people going to emergency rooms with symptoms of mental illness, people experiencing traumas and PTSD, anxiety, depression, etc., as a result of experiencing extreme weather, being forced from their home, and also worsened population mental health and well-being. So if we go to the next slide, I won't go into detail today from time, but I can put in the chat our briefing paper that explains all of this. But just to again mention that often in reporting, what's reported on is the number of deaths, the cost economically of damage to homes or livelihoods. But what is not taken into account is the cost to people and communities and to mental health and well-being. And that's often not reported on, even though that can far exceed the cases of physical injury or death. If we go to the next slide. So what we can see is a bit of, it sounds a bit all doom and gloom, exactly what we were just talking about is part of the problem. But climate change is exacerbating and challenging our mental health and well-being. And what that can mean is we can come into a vicious cycle that we noted of that challenge then limiting our capacity to respond. If we go to the next slide, of challenges, so that we need this good mental health and well-being, this ability to cope, this emotional and social resilience to be able to cope with and act on climate change. And so even though I frame this as a vicious cycle, what I usually go into talk about, and a time limited today, but is because this is a risk multiplier, it's also an opportunity multiplier. So if we can equip people and communities with the social and emotional coping strategies and infrastructures and skills, we can create a virtuous cycle where they're more equipped to cope with, but also more equipped to act on climate change. And the things that, so because climate change is a mental health emergency, climate action is also mental health action. So I'll come back to that in a moment. So if we, next slide. And just to note again, to Rima's point, that we can't look at any of these things in silos, and we need to start to draw the links out in the narratives that we're using. And I guess the recommendation that I would like to see as well as partly in the reporting of how we make the links between the kind of common causes and therefore common solutions. So if we look at something like poor air quality, we know that burning fossil fuels decreases air quality. There's research that people with exposure to air pollution, they're more likely to be from poorer communities. They experience physical health problems. 7 million people die a year from air pollution. Disregarding the climate, burning fossil fuels is toxic to human health. So we should be not doing it anyway, even if there wasn't a climate crisis. They're more likely to die from COVID-19, but also something people don't realize is that people with exposure to air pollution, even low levels, are more likely to have depression, anxiety, psychosis, higher suicide risk. So these things are all interrelated. And there's many more examples of this, but air pollution is just one of them. So if we go to the next slide, there's some of this Rima covered, so I'll talk over it very briefly, but just to note that of course, it's not only direct experiences, but being aware of these things that are challenging to our emotional and psychological health. And people respond in a whole bunch of ways. We know that young people seem particularly affected, but different groups, including obviously journalists working in this space. And we're working with climate scientists. The Met Office I just spoke to yesterday, their staff are really struggling because they're they're struggling to come to terms with these messages and the gap between what's happening and the action being taken. So these statistics, Rima also mentioned, but just to note that, again, having a strong emotional response in and of itself is not a mental health problem. And actually, the people who are having those responses are often the ones who you could say a climate aware psychologist would say are maybe the healthiest. They're the ones that care, have this empathetic response. But we need to acknowledge those emotions. We need to give space for people to feel them. We need to explicitly express that this is understandable and normal, and also be aware that there are people who are having a lot of psychological defense mechanisms to the fact that this does feel too overwhelming or too scary to sit in the discomfort of the uncomfortable truths. But sitting in that can also, without the right support, lead to mental health issues. So it's about the way we can guide people into appropriate coping and action skills. If we go to the next slide. So just in terms of, again, why this distress is coming about, it's not just that climate change is distressing, but the sense that there is insufficient action. And this is partly also, I think, to do with reporting on the action that is happening, or it's really hard for people to understand where change can and is being made. But for young people in a study of 10,000 young people around the world, the majority of them think the governments are betraying them and future generations. They're dismissing people's distress, and they're lying about the effectiveness of actions that they are taking. And this is really important in the context of coping, because the coping strategy that seems most effective for supporting well-being and supporting action in the context of the climate crisis is what's called meaning-focused coping, which relies on us being able to take actions in line with our values. It relies on us being able to create hope through those actions. And in part, it also relies on trust in other societal actors and societal cohesion. And so this also is what we hear from young people in the context of media, is they want the media to tell the truth. But there is, as we talked about, this challenge with, if that is only the gloom part of it and not giving them the opportunity to lead into action, then people might find it hard to face that truth. So if we can go to the next slide. In some of our own work, just to come back to this connection with COVID as well, we surveyed 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK in 2020, and we found that distress was higher for climate than COVID-19, even in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic, which was, to be honest, fairly surprising. This was particularly true for people who aren't otherwise so anxious. So the figure on the right is the red is climate change distress and the blue is pandemic-related distress. And this is for people with different levels of anxiety symptoms. So the difference was particularly striking when people weren't otherwise generally anxious. They were still anxious about the climate. And in other data in the US, we find about 10% for the top 10% of people, and this is true actually in the data in the UK as well, it's about 10% of the young people for whom the climate crisis is their most frequent worry. So they worry about it more than anything else in their life. But there's different emotional patterns. So understandably, the pandemic was related more to isolation, disconnection, frustration, and kind of that daily anxiety on their impact on their life. But climate change, they were actually more interested. They felt more guilt and shame, as well as more anger and disgust. And this comes again down to this sort of sense of injustice around climate. If we go to the next slide. But again, Rima's point that emotions aren't always negative, and people are going to have a range of different experiences. They can go up and down, can change every day, and they really relate to the narratives we hold and are told, and they really relate to the actions they take, and the actions we take impact our emotions, the emotions we have impact our actions. And if we want people to be able to hold this distress and at the same time have good health and well-being and take action, what seems important is hope and agency, which again, we heard before. And just to reiterate that the young people who are worried, but still have subjective well-being are higher on hope, meaningfulness, and anger. And we don't often talk about if we let ourselves sit with this, what's on the other side? We don't have to sit forever in these challenging emotions. We can actually create more meaning in our life, more purpose, and still thrive in the context of a changing climate with the right narratives, with the right support. And we heard from the young people that the most common positive impact of the climate crisis was the actions they take in their own life around pro-environmental behavior, supporting their own health and well-being. We go to the next slide. So I'm going to stop here for now, context of time, but I usually would also talk about how the climate crisis is, or climate action is an opportunity multiplier. And we don't hear enough about the carrot as well as the stick. And so Brian Eno spoke recently to us that captures what I'm trying to say, in that we first of all assume that humans are information processors. We give them the facts and they're going to take action. We know that doesn't work. To change minds, we need to change feelings. But we need to do that in a way that provides people an opportunity to envision a better future, to think about what kind of future do they want to create, and how the actions we take as individuals, as societies, and as systems change around the climate fundamentally improves our health and the health of our societies. So there's a huge opportunity here to make a better future through this transformation. And we don't talk enough about that other side of, like, this is a big threat, it's also a big opportunity. I'll now hand back to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's great, Emma, really amazing. So like during the chat, people were asking about some of the sources and some of the information, and anybody who has signed up, I understand, right, Paula, because you regularly do these webinars, you will get a link with the slides, and the slides we will also amend to have some of the sources in there, so you have access to the data. I see Paula nodding, so that's good. I'm saying the right thing. And I also want to draw attention to the fact that my colleague Minal will put a link to Google document into the chat, because we at the Dart Center will also stay engaged with this topic. And if you would like to hear more from us, you can add your name and your email to that document, the Google Doc, in the chat. So, and this, of course, is the perfect moment now to go over to Maren, because the question is, what does all of this mean to me as a practicing journalist? How do I convert this information into, or how do I integrate this information into my stories? Or maybe should I even integrate some of what you've said into my stories, because I'm a journalist and I'm objective and I'm not an activist, and maybe it's not my role to understand the psychology and make people feel good, because that's not my job. So I know that Maren has some answers to this. We don't have a slideshow for Maren, but yes, so what would you say to people? I'm not really sure, or to journalists specifically. I'm not sure this is my job. I'm an objective journalist, and do I need to deal with this?
Yeah, thanks again for Rima and Emma, really like opening up a space where I can 100% connect now to, and also to you, Julian, like mentioning what I like to call the bullshit bingo that usually comes up in journalists particular, when they hear about that they should now provide solutions, something that Emma and Rima mentioned, that they should report not only the facts, but that they need to take into account how they make people feel. And then they go like into shock mode. That's what I experienced during the last years often, or they go into defense mode. And I'm not going to, as Julian said, I'm not going to present any slides to you, but we are going to do practically, basically, the first self-efficacy, maybe lesson of the day today. So if you have some pen and paper somewhere close by in the digital age, please pull it out now, because as we've listened to a little bit, to change minds, information and facts is not enough. So you need to do some stuff yourself now. You need to make your own notes, basically. And I'm not going to try to pretend the professor here today, but just like hopefully everything that Rima and Emma said in the beginning is kind of influencing your mind already, and you are I don't know, let's say willed to pick up this practical lesson here. So I'll start, if you all have pen and paper, or maybe something where you can write on a digital pad, but usually it's actually better for your memory if you do it with your hand, because then your body is more involved. That's a whole different topic, but just believe me or trust me here. So I'll come to this bullshit bingo and thereby also directly try to kind of give you a short glimpse into my way of thinking, or let's say the last 15 or almost 20 years now, that how it shaped my life, and how the climate crisis, or like I prefer to call it these days, the climate emergency, affects my life, affects my decision making, and affects the trajectory of maybe you guys afterwards as well. Let's see. So the first one that usually comes up is, this is activism. So that's the first thing you should write down now, or you can write down now if you want to keep it in mind, this activism claim, like, I'm not an activist, I'm not going to report about the climate crisis. Why is that so wrong? Now I take on the glasses as the neuroscientist, because that's my profession by training, just like Emma, or just like Emma, that's like we have the same, let's say, university background, so to say, or at least overlaps. Why is that so wrong from a neuroscientific standpoint? Because everything you do changes your brain, independent of whether you're a journalist or just a normal human being, whether you're a man, a woman, or whatever you try to ascribe to yourself, or what roles you play. Everything, every little thought, every information you process changes your brain, and you can't do anything against it. So now when we look at the role of journalism and why it can never be non-activistic, is because it provides information to, if it's successful journalism, or how one way of measuring successful journalism is the reach, right? So how many people are reached? So it has the potential to reach many minds and thereby change many brains. And this brings me directly to this virtuous versus vicious circle that Emma mentioned in a different context, because now we can look at it and say, oh, wow, this is always manipulation, right? Every information is manipulating brains. Or we can look at it as an opportunity. And you can take more of a responsible role, or take that responsibility that you have while sending information, while being a professional journalist, more serious, and try to ask yourselves, how do I want to change brains? Because you are changing them anyway. You can't avoid that. And that brings me to the second aspect of this bullshit bingo, and the second thing you might want to write down or draw something about. Just do it in a way where you can relate to it. Because if I would show you slides, it would be my way of relating to it. So the second one is the objectivity, and that's directly connected to it, of course. Right? So there is this claim, and let's say it's has a different degree or different strengths in different circles and countries and areas of journalism. But overall, many journalists are convinced that they can do something like objective reporting. And if you listen to the first bullshit claim already, you now should stand up, scream, yell, whatever, and say, no, it's impossible. Why? Just remember, maybe if you've seen The Dress, that was this dress, which was kind of getting a lot of attention. It was the, let's say, 2 minutes of fame of vision neuroscience, where I feel quite driven to, or feel quite attached to, because people were looking at this dress, an image of a dress, and were arguing about what colors they see. So why am I mentioning this now? Because even when we talk about something supposedly easy, like naming colors, right? Probably you would all agree that this is kind of a pinkish reddish shirt that I'm wearing, yeah? But even if we look at something like colors, we don't have an objective perception. Perception is never objective because we have this subjective brain in our head. And now just scale it a little up in terms of complexity when we go from colors, something that you might find easy or simple, to something like freedom, peace, democracy, or not to mention even the good life, right? And we've listened a lot to what Rima said, especially in the beginning also, like, okay, it's really affecting all areas, and we hopefully come back to that, and Emma mentioned as well, all areas of our life. So we have to ask the question, how do we want to live? Because there is no objective truth to it, which doesn't mean that there's some relativism and you can say whatever you want, like 2 + 2 = 5 suddenly. No, of course not. I mean, I'm a scientist by brain, by heart, by every organ I have. So of course it's important to have different, let's say, sets of how we relate to things and how we, for example, do math, physics, biology. But it's always, and that's what Juliane referred to when she was talking about the learnings from the, or possible learnings, potential learnings from the corona reporting, right? That science is always, some people call it the current state of knowing what we know, right? It sounds a bit like a tautology, but that's really true, right? It's meant to change depending on how much further we are able to understand certain processes. And that brings me to the third and last aspect of this bullshit bingo that I want to play with you, or that I'm presenting to you, so to say. And that's usually then when people come up with like, yeah, we need to talk more about solutions, something that Emma and Rima so strongly advocated for, and I'm strongly advocating now again. So N = 3 here. We need more solutions, and hopefully Emma and Rima's arguments convinced you enough that that's really, really crucial. So the claim here then, or the misunderstanding really is like, oh yeah, so then you are going to give us the positive stories that we should all drink like oat milk, soy milk, whatever, and don't fly, or fly a little less, and do a bit more cycling or whatever, right? So you present the positive stories, but that's kind of like a niche thing to the cruel, whatever, objective bad world, right? And that's so far from the truth. And I, again, really hope that Emma's and Rima's data and also stories gave you a bit of an idea already, or maybe a bigger idea already, because you've listened and thought about this before, that we need more solutions, because that's the only way how people will realize that they can do something and will not go into this state of, and you've heard that before, learned helplessness, where they feel like, I can't do anything, the doomism, right? So what we now experience, especially with regard to the climate reporting a lot, is that we go straight from denial, which was the focus for the last decades, so to say, to doomerism, where you say, okay, now it's too late. Before it wasn't happening at all, but now it's too late. And that's really the challenge here. We shouldn't do that, but we should understand more about psychology. And this is where we'll end with the bullshit bingo and go a little bit into how we can do it better and what it means on the practical level. And we should go more into the direction of talking about solutions, what the individual, but also what the individual in its different roles in terms of organizations, politics, companies, journalists, whatever, what they can contribute and what they can do. And that brings me to what is now a bigger movement, and hopefully you've heard about it in journalism, is the constructive or solution-oriented journalism. Solution-oriented, let's say here a short, very short summary of the theory or the technical distinction between constructive and solution reporting. Solution reporting is basically a subset of the bigger set of constructive reporting. And if you want to understand constructive reporting, there's basically one main line that you should keep in mind. Maybe that's the point that you want to write down something again, which is constructive journalism means asking the question, what now? And that's exactly what Emma and Rima were pointing to so much, right? Where do we go from here? Independent of what happened before, independent of what might happen in the future, we can be decisive about it, and we can ask ourselves, where do we want to go from here? And now, again, maybe the, let's say, 3+1 bullshit argument. Yeah, but it's not my job as a journalist to come up with the solutions, right? No, it's not. But coming back to the objectivity, it's your task to ask the crucial questions. So if you ask your interview partners, if you look at studies with this different angle, remember, objectivity is not possible anyway, you always have your subjective lens. If you look at it with a different angle, where you always ask, what now? Where you ask people who survived something bad, like an event attributed to the climate crisis, what helped you? What would you have needed in order to be better equipped, better prepared? That's a whole different story you're going to write or report or record or whatever. And that's only because you ask different questions. So much about objective reporting. And that brings me to why I quit science first, or let's say put a halt on it in 2013, where I stopped, or I finished my PhD in London actually, no longer in London, so I feel a bit connected again, like talking to some people sitting in London right now. And I thought, okay, there is this wonderful city, right? And there's all these charities and there's all this work going on, and why is it not in the news? Especially when it comes to the climate crisis, and especially when it comes to the destruction of our own life basis, the beautiful planet we currently live on, and probably the only one we can live on. So I saw this kind of mismatch between what's happening in terms of what people are doing, feeling their self-efficacy on a daily life, and what we see in the news when it comes to the climate crisis and all related topics like the biodiversity loss and basically all the planetary boundaries, or the topics of the planetary boundaries. And I was like, why is that? And I came up let's say months after months with the answers that I presented in the bullshit bingo. And I realized, oh, it's because these misunderstandings are dominating journalism, especially on the higher levels, let's say the editors in chief. Because it's a tradition. We are humans who are made of habits, and that's usually helpful because our brain tries to save energy. But when they are so ingrained in our brain that we don't look any longer outside of, or think outside of the box, and don't look around what's happening maybe in other areas, for example, psychology and what we know now about how the brain processes information, then we are stuck. So I thought, okay, well, what can I do about it? Knowing a little bit, like I would never ever claim I understand the brain, knowing a little bit about how the brain functions, how can we do better journalism? And then I encountered this by then already small but growing movement internationally of the constructive journalism. And then I founded my own media company back in Germany with some other crazy enough scientists who jumped on board. And we did a huge crowdfunding campaign where we said, okay, we want to be the first German-speaking constructive online media. And with the focus and driven by this motivation that climate is not getting enough attention. And I guess that's where we're coming back in the discussion to, and that was basically Rima's first point, that she termed, or that is termed these days often as the fragmentation, right? It's usually something that we see maybe in the environmental, and as you said, in the economist or in the science section, but not as this overarching thing, as a dimension of every topic. So we thought, okay, we want to do constructive reporting about this topic that is so under-addressed, has been so under-addressed during the last 4 decades. And by now, I call it the biggest failure of journalism, actually, that this has been done, or not done, I should rather say. And that's why I was basically the editor-in-chief of a new online magazine, and also responsible for a team of 15 to 20 people doing journalism, doing constructive journalism in Germany, which is tough, I can say. I don't want to say, yeah, I'm super strong, but it is tough because these, let's say, backlashes of traditional journalism are really, really big, and especially in Germany, there's a lot of traditionalism around the whole, let's say, concept and idea, the objectivity claim, and all these other things. But fast forward a couple of years, constructive journalism now is no longer, I'm pretty convinced to say this now, or pretty certain that that is a valid, let's say, current state of the art description these days. It's no longer a niche topic. It's no longer considered a trend that's going to remain again. It's really considered a fundamentally different way of doing reporting and looking at reporting. And now coming to an end, because I see I have 15 minutes now already, this is where I want to start the discussion. How do you see maybe your way of contributing in a constructive way, in a solution-oriented way, when it comes to climate reporting, or when it comes to our future, because that's basically what the climate is about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have asked all of you, all the three speakers, and I would like to do that before we go to the Q&A, for 3 tips. And as you're finishing, Maren, I'm actually wondering if maybe as part or as your 3 tips, if you could give like a couple of practical examples of what you've just spoken about. So, you know, how would somebody have covered a story in a, like, let's call it traditional way, and how did you change it? If you can make reference to 1 or 2 particular stories, just so that we can imagine it, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, one story I actually wrote myself was about, and we only shortly touched on it, and I mentioned the oat milk, was about the basically all the food crises, or the question, how are we going to eat in the future? And there's usually these 2 camps, or at least 2 camps, right? So you have like the people who are the meat front, let's say, and the people who are the militant vegans. And there's a bit of a spectrum in between, but they are fighting then, right? And usually then, because it's this traditional approach, and that's also the recommendation here, the first recommendation I would give, that you say, okay, we need to listen to the other side as well, right? So if somebody comes up with an idea, and that's of course detrimental in science reporting, we need to listen to somebody who says the exact opposite, if possible, because we want to have an argument. And I said, okay, if I'm going to open the topic about how we're going to eat in the future, or how it's possible, what are we going to eat in the future, in this way, there will be the 2 camps again, yelling and screaming at each other. So how can we reframe that in a constructive way? Well, we can ask or claim, the headline was then, this is the food that's going to save the world. The menu that's going to save the world. And then people go a bit like, okay, maybe this is a joke, right? So as you all know, the headlines are really important. And in the article, I outlined then, together with a team of other journalists, I outlined, okay, what is the fundamental need that we all have? Well, we need to eat, right? So then the next question could be, okay, how are we going to produce it? Instead of, I want my meat, or the other person saying, no, I don't want this because of this and that. So by combining, and that's the second tip then, always asking yourself, combining or redefining the groups. Because this group thinking, or what is called in psychology tribal thinking, is really ingrained in us. So when you see, for example, vegan and you are a meat eater, all the alarm bells in your head kind of start to ring. If you don't open up those groups, but try to redefine a group by asking, what do these people share? And in this case, very easy, we all need to eat, right? We all eaters, so to say. And then you can ask, okay, how do we want to eat, or what, or when, and so ever. So redefining groups without opening up opposing camps is the second tip here. And the first one was like, how can we reframe the question, right? And then the third one is really, really to understand that it's fundamentally, and I'm so happy that we saw some data already about this, it's fundamentally, the climate question is a question about justice. It's a question about justice not only to the people who live now, but potential people who will live in the future, including offspring that's maybe already alive, or these human beings who are maybe already alive, but also future generations. And we've seen the data I'm referring to here is about, especially in the US, there's lots of data about this, but also coming up in other countries where poorer people live, that they suffer more. And I'm not only saying this because I'm a woman, because it's so important, women suffer more already, and they will suffer way more in the future for several reasons I'm not going to go into detail now. But it's fundamentally not a question of the environment, it's a question of justice. We need the environment in order to have any future, but it's a question of how do we want to live together, and do we want to have a just way of doing so.
Okay, thanks. And can I get the other 2 panelists to give us their tips? I don't know who wants to go first, Emma or Rima.
Maybe Rima can go first, because I thoroughly agree with the 3 pillars of Rima's approach. But if she outlines them, then maybe I can build on a couple of extra things. But she's going to capture a lot of what I would have come up with as the 3 pillars as well. So I'll build on her response.
Yeah, as I told you before, I'm working with this group of psychologists from Psychologists for Future, and we wrote media recommendations from a psychological perspective on covering the climate crisis. And they actually contain 3 basic recommendations. So that's what I'll bring in here now. And if they are, like, I talked about them before, but I will now just mention the 3 of them shortly. So the first one is, I would say, write about the climate crisis as much as you can, whenever it has relevance. So every time when you write about a topic and you think it has a connection with the climate, then mention it or ask your interview partner about it. Make clear that there is a connection. The second recommendation is that because this will trigger emotions in the recipients, whenever possible, give space to emotions, talk about emotions. Just make it clear that this is an issue coming up when you read about the climate crisis, and that it's normal and it's adequate, and we need emotions. And the third recommendation is that something Maren talked about now just quite a bit is presenting solutions, talking about solutions, not coming up with them. I agree that's not the job of journalists, but there are solutions out there. It's not like we don't know what we have to do. There is a lot of knowledge about what we have to do. Give it space, help people by showing them that there are solutions and how they can get into action. And I think the link to our recommendations will be posted in the chat. So there is a short version, it's just a quick overview of what I said now, but there is also a longer version with all the sources you can check if you would like to read that.
Yeah, thank you. I think both speakers, obviously we just have so much resonance between and overlap between what we all think. So there might be some repetition here, but I'll try and build off of it. So yeah, so the first thing, as both speakers said, is around telling the truth about the climate emergency, which I'm sure all of you in this room sort of already do, insofar as you're the ones sort of on this call. We hear from young people the distress, is particularly around, reading articles, even in the context of the heat waves in the UK last year, whatever it was, of, people, like pictures of people, having ice creams on the beach, and rather than sometimes, painting some of these things that are happening with a frivolousness around it. And that is very distressing for people who feel that disconnect between, why is this being reported in this way when this doesn't match the reality of what this means in the situation. But sometimes, we obviously, your job is, and it's a challenging one, is to appeal to a range of different people and different audiences. But sometimes I think the language we use around climate change and the climate crisis, it pigeonholes it. And we have all spoken about the need for more of a systems view, that this affects everything, will affect everything, and that there are massive, people talk about the costs of action, but there are massive costs of inaction to people, their families, their lives, and all aspects of that. And even, what I was talking about before with air pollution, I think for many communities, it's, they see the climate crisis as, again, there's somewhat of a disconnect of it's something that's happening to other people or in the future. Obviously, that's not the case for many communities around the world already living this reality. But for some communities, for example, in the UK, they're struggling with so many things now, like the cost of living crisis, but they don't necessarily, haven't joined the dots. They don't see that connection of the cost of living crisis to the massive historical injustices of government slashing funding for renewables, for home installation projects, for projects that were going to, for policies that were going to make sure all new homes were built with appropriate standards. The cost of that is now costing people their money, their lives right now. And so sometimes talking about something like, the energy crisis, or what it means to live in a cold home, the connection to fuel poverty, the connection to people being sick, how that's happening to poorer communities, that is part of climate reporting, because somewhat of the causes of that energy crisis relate to our reliance on fossil fuels and these mega profits of fossil fuel companies, but also the solutions of investing in, for example, home installation schemes in the UK, that creates jobs. It also means that people aren't living with fuel poverty and in colder homes. That has massive impacts for their health and mental health. Children in less cold homes miss less days of school, and also it reduces the consumption of fuel. So there are these multiple solutions that come out of acknowledging these connections. So trying to, in the language and in the storytelling and in the narratives, use that system thinking and kind of join the dots for people. And similarly, like with air pollution, even if we just disregard the climate crisis, thinking about it as, well, how is burning fossil fuels toxic for our health and our communities, and widening that language and the ways that we talk about this that appeal to different communities. And again, that links to the justice angle and telling the truth insofar as naming what's happening. I think a lot of times people think, well, I can't go so far as to name like fossil fuels as the cause of someone suffering, but it's sort of like talking about lung cancer rates without talking about smoking or tobacco companies. We have to name like what's going on. And again, to reiterate, sort of explicitly acknowledging that these things will bring up emotions for people, and just trying to explicitly acknowledge and name that within. And everyone's experiencing that, even the sort of objective scientists, they're very objective in the way that they collect and process data, but they're feeling this, they're grappling with this. So it's in my mind, the role of the creative industries, and I know journalism maybe borders with this slightly, but is how do we tell stories that help us start to process what world we're trying to create and what the possibilities and opportunities are. Because wherever point we are, there's things to grieve, there's things to be angry about, but there is always a better and worse path forward. And there's always something to be upset about, but there's always a better future to be pushing for. And that what we know we need for good mental health and well-being in our communities in terms of cleaner air, more access to green space, more cohesive and connected communities, active transport, all of these things actually help our health and our mental health, while being some of the solutions to the way we restructure our world and our communities in the context of climate. So painting that picture and helping people join the dots based on all the evidence of what we can be aiming for as well as what we're running away from, I think is really important. I'll stop there. I think that reiterates some of what everyone else said too.
Okay, thanks, Emma. So we've been monitoring the chat box, and there are actually not that many questions in it. So I'm going to slightly change things, and partly because there is a friend and colleague of mine in on this webinar, Giulio Rubino, who sits in Rome. You may have seen the cat. Known Giulio for over a decade now. He is the editor and co-director of the investigative reporting project Italy, ERP Media, and he teaches journalism at La Sapienza in Rome. And Giulio, I think I've just texted with you, and you said it's okay if I throw to you mute yourself. But you do some really, really hard-hitting investigations, and clearly you're hoping for impact with this. And some of it, I should say, has received journalism funding. But for example, we spoke during the pandemic, we spoke a lot about increasing our role when it comes to reporting on the climate crisis. And you've done some very specific, difficult investigations into greenwashing in the EU. We're nearly out of time, and I want to see if there is time for one or two more questions at the end. But I'm just curious what you say about this, given the investigations that you do, which are impact driven, as most investigative journalism is, I would say. And if there is, in this context, anything you would ask from the panelists, any advice or, yeah. I leave that to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, I came to work on the climate crisis after spending most of my career working on organized crime and corruption and drug trafficking. So I try to apply the same method. And as with this other criminal phenomena, you try to look at the source. And one thing that I try to go through the bullshit bingo, and I'm happy to say I'm not affected by some of the first things that Maureen named, but I become much more wary when we talk about constructive journalism, because I think that if we really look at some of the main problems or the main hurdles in trying to tackle the climate crisis or emergency, however you want to call them, they are essentially divisive. And they are divisive because they are political. And this is something that we kind of refrain from saying because, you know, to stop the climate emergency, you have to destroy capitalism. It's banal, but it's true. I worked extensively on how the European Green Deal has been watered down in several different passages. First, because of the emergency of COVID, then with all the lobbying that has been destroying the taxonomy of green investment that Europe was trying to make, then with the sanctions to Russia, in which we sanction everything but not oil, and we still are buying oil, although indirectly, from Russia. So the power of the big oil lobbies, but our instinctive need to remain inside the status quo. And I would say that if anything, editors, journalists, we are first world, relatively well-paid middle-class people, the status quo works for us. So instinctively, everybody tries to defend the status quo. And every change to the status quo is perceived as dangerous by the editors and by the readers as well. So my question would be, how can I try and put a major accent not on the aspects that are more spectacular and visible about climate change, but on these political aspects that I've been reporting extensively on these things that I was telling you, and the reaction always only comes from experts. It's hard to make the taxonomy and the lobbying on the taxonomy of green investment sexy for our readers. But that's the point. I think that how we produce food comes after, and unless we're ready to face the real big issue. We know that just a bunch of companies produce the vast majority of carbon emissions. So again, I don't want to dump the responsibility of the climate crisis on the reader, because whatever you eat meat, you might have to stop in a certain amount of time of eating meat. But if this is not just a crisis, but an emergency, shouldn't I be focusing on the main problem? And isn't the main problem the fact that we will keep on using fossil fuels, and we prefer to say, oh, well, nuclear energy, if you think about it, that's actually green, or gas is just not that bad. We can use gas as long as we don't buy from Russia directly. If we buy from India, it's fine. Unless we find a way to I feel, it's my perception that if we struggle on how to present local issues and dump the change in lifestyle on the single reader, it might be very effective in the long term. Like, of course, you need a change of culture, and the change of culture doesn't come from above, and I agree with all of that. But I feel that given the time that we have or don't have, I would like to learn to be more effective in this kind of reporting, in facing this issue. Normally, so and with this I close, normally we would have used 30 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, something like an ideology that puts everything together. And even if people do not really understand how and why the mechanism of some sort of productive system affects their life, they didn't know the technicality of it, but at least, an adherence to a general set of ideas that can be communicated easily could have, swayed at least on the elections the public. Now we don't have this. Like, everything is center left and center right, and they have the exact same politics on climate. So it's very hard even to look for a solution there. It's very hard to think that I can orient the vote and thus produce change in a democratical process when the table where the legislation is being watered down is absolutely not only not democratic, but it's not transparent. The European Union doesn't even answer to Freedom of Information Act requests on this situation, and there's nothing to be done about it. They don't reply. There's no transparency. It's being done in an absolutely non-democratic way in our democratic institution. That wall does not break, and we don't have the push of public opinion to crack it in a stronger way. So I don't know.
Okay, we've got 5
I'm
minutes.
open to suggestions of all kinds.
I mean, I know we're diving into something super difficult in the last 5 minutes, but I feel it is also worth putting some of the difficulties on the table. And yes, I also see the comment from the freelancer, which is always a problem for journalists. And I want to honor that by pointing that out. I mean, is there, Maren, I saw you nodding a bit when Julia was speaking, actually, Rima as well.
Shall I try that we all have 1 minute maybe to give a bit of a shout? Emma, I saw your hand as well. Yeah, okay. Of course, 1 minute is not enough because we need at least another day now. And I'm happy that you mentioned all these questions now. So without further ado, essentially, it boils down to a question of power. And that's what you so beautifully described, basically. And that brings us back to where and how do we get this power? And that brings us to the psychological level. And that doesn't mean, oh yeah, it's all the individuals. So please give me those 30 seconds. It really starts with the feeling of that I can change something. And all these corporations are just humans. And that's not just my naive way of thinking about it, but that's true, right? So the question is not who has power, but whom do we give power in the future? And that's essentially, for example, when it comes to energy, like draw the connections, make the dots, because you said it's either or, right? Is it the individual versus the, let's say, state level? No, you need to give the people the power. For example, with energy, it's so beautiful because we can do it in a community-oriented way, and we can do it with all other areas as well. So give them the power, and then change will happen. This is when we look at the past, and I'm not a historian, how, for example, we got women's rights and all these kind of things, right? 25% is the magic number here. 25% of a group needs to have that idea that they want to have a change, and then it happens. Full stop.
As Maren was talking about power, I thought again about the word powerlessness. And that's what I think comes into play here. If you report on these things about lobbies, about big corporations, for the readers, I think very often it gives them a feeling of this is too big for me. So the question is, what can we do about this? And how can we, because you need the support from society, from the readers, that this affects something, and they in turn, they feel powerless when they read this. That's a vicious circle. And one thing that came into my mind when I think about what can you actually report to give people the feeling they are not powerless, and I thought about this, probably everybody knows the story. There is this farmer or villager from Peru who sues a big German energy company. I've read a lot of reports about that, but I think this is one of the stories that help if you connect to other people, if you connect to organizations which help you to fight these fights that we need to fight. That's an important message to give them, that we cannot fight them alone, that's true. But if we join together, and there are organizations which help you, or they get together and try to find solutions, that's a starting point, I would say.
Yeah, so I'll quickly add on just to say that I'm not an expert in this at all. So I think it's a really, really important, interesting point to unpack at a bigger time. First of all, we need the kind of journalism that you're describing that actually looks at, well, what are the causes here? Where are the levers for power? Where are the levers for change? And I don't think that that understanding is widespread. And sometimes people feel like it doesn't apply to them. So it's, first of all, connecting those massive injustices and power imbalances to what's happening to people like on the ground in communities, platforming and raising those voices and helping lift up the voices of people who are already affected and will be affected. We hear from friends working in climate finance that when banks and stuff sign off on different things, one of the reasons that they'll say they're making change because of XYZ business case, but when you talk to them, they're making change because they're scared about their grandson's future. And so it's connecting, like, what, as you said, what are the people within these organizations? What are their motivations? Why are they not making change? But I think actually making that case that this is a massive injustice, like a small group of people are holding the rest of humanity to ransom. I think that's something that isn't widespread and isn't understood. But then it's, well, what do people can do with their vote and with applying pressure through these organizations that they can go and join, and also with their own finances. So I think what a lot of people don't know is the things that they can do around divesting from the banks that are funding this kind of thing. And those kind of things are starting to make pressure of the insurance companies, the banks, the ones that are actually financing and holding these things, these current systems to account. And also, what's the alternative? If we say dismantle capitalism, sounds extremely scary for people. One, because they don't see what the alternative future looks like, and how that could be better. So again, painting that picture of not only the stick, but also the carrot. So, okay, this is an injustice that's not just about environmentalism or a few left-leaning people. This is an injustice hitting communities, all people, and it's the few against everyone. And how do we change that? What is that alternative vision of the future that we could be working towards? And how do we do that in a just transition? So a lot of people are scared because their jobs, their livelihoods and things would maybe at risk when we change. So this comes down to the just transition. And there's a lot of work done about how do we transition away from these things in a way that's just, in a way that's helping the people who are already working in these spaces. And how do we make sure that that is centered as well, that justice in this transformation, and that we have the capacity to do this as people. We're very adaptable as a species, and we can be, and so it's holding both of those things together. But yeah, again, I'm not an expert in this and would love to continue that conversation, but those are some of the things that came to mind.
And this is clearly a long, big conversation, and this is a conversation that we would like to engage more in. So if you haven't put your name on the Google Doc before we're closing this, to be in touch if we're doing more. But yes, Paula and Daniel, I hope you forgive me for slightly, and everybody else on the call as well, for slightly changing the format and not doing more Q&As, but we could see from the chat that there weren't that many questions in it. And I can see the appreciation for the last 5 minutes. I hope I'm forgiven. So thank you very much for everybody who came and who took the time out for this. I know it's Friday and it's lunchtime. We'll let you go. So thanks a lot, and especially to the panelists who really are very busy people. I know that, and they've given their time to prepare and be here. So thanks a lot, and hopefully soon we'll have more.